I'm Maya Chen, and at 26, I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. Growing up in Sacramento with my younger sister Jessica, I'd watched her charm her way out of trouble while I cleaned up her messes. But nothing prepared me for the morning I discovered she'd drained my entire wedding fund for plastic surgery, leaving me staring at a zero balance 3 weeks before my big day. What happened next changed everything, and I mean everything, about how I saw family, loyalty, and my own worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The foundation of my relationship with Jessica was built on an unspoken agreement that I never actually agreed to. From childhood, I was the responsible one, the problem solver, the sister who made sure Jessica never faced real consequences. When she was 12 and stole money from mom's purse to buy makeup, I covered for her, claiming I'd moved the cash to help with groceries. When she crashed dad's car at 16, drunk from a party she wasn't supposed to attend, I helped craft the lie about black ice and bad weather. Every time Jessica stumbled, I was there with a safety net, believing that's what good sisters did. Our parents, Robert and Linda Chen, ran a modest accounting firm in Elk Grove, and they'd worked hard to provide us with stability, but somewhere along the way, they'd fallen into a pattern with Jessica that bordered on worship. She was their beautiful, spirited daughter who just needed more understanding, more patience, more chances. I was their reliable daughter who didn't need much attention because I had everything figured out. This dynamic calcified over the years until it became the truth we all lived by. Jessica had always been obsessed with appearance, spending hours perfecting her makeup for Instagram photos that rarely got more than 50 likes. She called herself an influencer, though her following was mostly made up of high school acquaintances and fake accounts. She lived at home, contributing nothing to household expenses while building what she called her personal brand. Mom and Dad supported this, calling it entrepreneurship, while I worked 60-hour weeks as a freelance graphic designer to build my career and save for my future. The pattern intensified when I got engaged to David Kim, a software engineer I'd met through my best friend Tyler Martinez. David was everything I wanted in a partner: steady, ambitious, and kind, with a dry sense of humor that balanced my sometimes overly serious nature. Our engagement was a quiet affair, a sunset proposal at the American River where we'd had our first date, but it represented something huge for me. Finally, something in my life was about mine, something Jessica couldn't claim or overshadow. Planning our wedding became my obsession and my joy. David and I had decided on an outdoor ceremony at Riverfront Gardens, a picturesque venue overlooking the Sacramento River. We wanted something intimate but memorable, vintage touches with fairy lights strung through oak trees and mason jar centerpieces filled with wild flowers. The guest list topped 150 people, including David's large extended family and my own relatives who I hadn't seen in years, but who'd helped shape who I'd become. For 2 years I'd been methodically saving every spare dollar. I took on extra freelance projects, designing logos for startups and creating marketing materials for small businesses. I skipped dinners out, bought generic groceries, and wore the same 3 professional outfits in rotation. Every sacrifice felt purposeful because it was building towards something beautiful, something that would mark the beginning of my life with David. The wedding fund grew slowly but steadily in a separate savings account I'd opened specifically for this purpose. $15,000 represented countless late nights, weekend work sessions, and careful budgeting. It wasn't a fortune, but in Sacramento, it was enough for the wedding we wanted, the photographer who'd capture our story, the flowers that would transform the venue, and the catering that would feed our families and friends. Jessica knew about the fund because I'd made the mistake of sharing my excitement about reaching certain savings milestones. When I hit $10,000, I'd celebrated with a small dinner out, and she'd rolled her eyes at what she called my obsession with planning. When I reached 15,000, I'd felt a sense of pride that I'd rarely experienced. I was building something real, something that represented my ability to work toward a goal and achieve it, but Jessica's attitude toward my engagement had grown increasingly bitter. She made cutting remarks about David, questioning why I was settling for someone so boring. She complained that all I talked about was wedding planning, conveniently ignoring the fact that she talked exclusively about influencers she followed and products she wanted to try. During family dinners, she'd interrupt my updates about venue decisions or dress shopping to show everyone photos from Instagram accounts with millions of followers, pointing out what real success looked like. The toxic dynamic reached new heights when Jessica announced she'd been accepted to what she called an intensive personal branding workshop in Los Angeles. The cost was $12,000, and she needed it immediately to secure her spot. She presented this to our parents as an investment in her future, complete with a PowerPoint presentation about return on investment and market positioning. Mom and Dad were hesitant about the cost, but Jessica wore them down with tears, promises, and emotional manipulation that I recognized but couldn't combat. I should have seen the warning signs when Jessica suddenly became interested in my wedding planning. She started asking detailed questions about my timeline, my budget, and my accounts. She offered to help with vendor coordination, something she'd never shown interest in before. I mistook this for sisterly support, believing that maybe my upcoming marriage was bringing us closer together. I even gave her access to some of my vendor contact information, thinking she might learn something useful for her own future. Tyler had been warning me about Jessica's behavior for months. During our weekly coffee catch-ups at a cafe in Midtown, he'd point out inconsistencies in her stories or question her sudden interest in my wedding details. Tyler worked at a local tech startup and had an analytical mind that saw patterns I missed. He'd grown up with sisters of his own and recognized manipulation tactics that I'd become blind to through years of exposure. One evening, Tyler had been particularly direct during our conversation. We were sitting outside the cafe, watching the sunset paint the Sacramento skyline in shades of orange and pink, when he'd turned to me with a serious expression. "Maya, I need you to hear something, and I need you to really listen," he'd said. "Jessica is planning something, I don't know what, but the way she's been asking about your wedding, about your finances, it's not sisterly curiosity, it's reconnaissance." I'd laughed off his concern, defending Jessica out of habit more than conviction. "She's just finally taking an interest in my life," I'd told him. "Maybe she's growing up, realizing that family is important." Tyler had shaken his head, his expression troubled. "I hope you're right, but please, just be careful, don't give her access to anything important." His warning echoed in my mind over the following weeks, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the mounting excitement of my approaching wedding. David and I had finalized our menu with the caterer, confirmed the flower arrangements, and received the proofs from our engagement photo session. Everything was falling into place exactly as I'd envisioned.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And I felt a sense of control and accomplishment that I'd rarely experienced. The morning I discovered the theft started like any other Tuesday. David had left early for a client meeting, kissing me goodbye while I was still half asleep in our shared apartment in Midtown. I'd planned to spend the day working on a logo design for a local bakery, then meeting with our wedding photographer to discuss timeline details for the ceremony. I made coffee, settled at my desk with my laptop, and decided to quickly check our wedding account balance to confirm we had enough padding for any last-minute additions. The number on the screen didn't make sense at first. Where $15,000 should have been, there was a balance of $43.18. I refreshed the page, certain there was an error, but the number remained the same. My hands started shaking as I clicked through the transaction history, my eyes scanning dates and amounts that told a story I wasn't ready to accept. Withdrawal after withdrawal, all made over the previous week while I'd been focused on final wedding preparations. $5,000 on Monday, $4,000 on Tuesday, $3,000 on Wednesday, The pattern continued until my carefully accumulated savings had been systematically drained. Each transaction showed the same method, online transfer, and each bore the digital signature I'd foolishly shared with Jessica months earlier, when she'd offered to help with wedding expenses. The room seemed to spin as the reality sank in. My sister had stolen my wedding fund, methodically and deliberately, while I'd been trusting her with details about my most important day. I called the bank immediately, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to a customer service representative who sounded bored by what was apparently a common family dispute. Without Jessica's admission of theft or evidence of fraud, there was nothing they could do. The transactions had been authorized using legitimate access codes. I tried calling Jessica, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I tried calling my parents, but they were with clients and couldn't talk. I sat in my apartment, staring at the empty account, feeling a betrayal so complete it was almost physical. This wasn't just about money, though $15,000 represented months of sacrifice and careful planning. This was about trust, family, and the assumption that the people closest to you wouldn't destroy your dreams for their own selfish purposes. When David came home that evening, he found me sitting on our couch, still in my pajamas, staring at the printed bank statements scattered across the coffee table. The look on my face must have told him everything he needed to know because he didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat beside me, wrapped his arms around me, and waited until I was ready to explain. "The wedding is off," I whispered, the words feeling surreal as I spoke them. "Jessica took everything. Our entire fund, gone." David pulled back to look at me, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and heartbreak. "We can postpone," he said immediately. "We can push it back a few months, save up again." But I shook my head, knowing that wasn't the real problem. "It's not about the money," I told him. "It's about what she did. It's about who she is, who they all are. I can't marry you with this hanging over us. I can't start our life together while my family is destroying everything I try to build." David held me while I cried, his own disappointment evident but secondary to his concern for me. That night, I called Tyler, and he came over immediately with ice cream and righteous anger. When I showed him the bank statements, his reaction was swift and decisive. "We're calling the police," he said. "This is theft, Maya, plain and simple." But I knew it wasn't that simple. Jessica was family, and pressing charges would create a scandal that would overshadow any justice I might receive. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house in Elk Grove, the bank statements clutched in my hand like evidence of a crime that no one would acknowledge. The house looked exactly the same as it had during my childhood, modest and well-maintained, with Mom's flower garden blooming despite the chaos that was about to unfold inside. I found Jessica in the backyard, lounging by the pool with her phone propped up on a tripod, recording what appeared to be her morning skincare routine for her 17 followers. She was wearing a new designer bikini I didn't recognize, the tag still attached and dangling from the straps. Her face looked different, subtly but unmistakably altered, with lips that seemed fuller and cheekbones that appeared more pronounced than they had just a week ago. She glanced up when she saw me approaching, her expression shifting from annoyance at the interruption to something that might have been guilt if she were capable of that emotion. "Maya, you look terrible," she said, lowering her phone but not bothering to stop the recording. "Are you getting enough sleep? Wedding stress can really age you." I held up the bank statements, my hands surprisingly steady despite the rage coursing through my veins. "We need to talk, Jessica. Now." She rolled her eyes dramatically, finally ending her recording with an exaggerated sigh. "Can't it wait? I'm in the middle of creating content. This lighting is perfect, and I've already done my skincare prep." The casual dismissal of my obvious distress was so typical of Jessica that it almost made me laugh. Here I was, holding evidence of her theft, and she was concerned about losing good lighting for her Instagram stories. I walked closer, forcing her to acknowledge my presence, and spread the bank statements on the patio table beside her designer water bottle and phone. $15,000, Jessica, my entire wedding fund, gone. She glanced at the papers with feigned confusion, her newly enhanced lips forming a perfect pout. I have no idea what you're talking about, Maya. Maybe you should keep better track of your finances. David probably spent it on something and forgot to tell you. Her attempt at gaslighting was so transparent it was almost insulting. I pulled out my phone and showed her the transaction history, each withdrawal clearly marked with the digital signature she'd used. Your signature, Jessica. Your access codes. Your theft. She barely looked at the screen before shrugging, her indifference more cutting than any anger could have been. Look, Maya, I borrowed some money for an investment opportunity. It's not like you'll never get it back. I'm going to be huge on social media after my transformation, and then I'll pay you back with interest. She gestured vaguely at her face and body, as if the changes were obvious improvements rather than the evidence of my stolen dreams. The word borrowed hit me like a physical blow. She was acting as if she'd asked permission, as if draining my savings account was some kind of family loan rather than outright theft. I stared at her, trying to reconcile this selfish stranger with the sister I'd protected and defended for years. You didn't borrow anything, Jessica. You stole my wedding fund to pay for plastic surgery. She finally sat up, her expression shifting to defensive anger. It's called investing in myself, Maya, something you wouldn't understand because you're content being mediocre forever. This surgery is going to change my life, open doors you can't even imagine. I'll be booking brand partnerships, getting sponsored posts, maybe even landing reality TV appearances. The delusion in her voice was staggering. She genuinely believed that her surgical enhancements would transform her into some kind of social media sensation, despite having no personality, talent, or work ethic to support such a fantasy. I looked at her face again, noting the telltale signs of recent procedures, the slight swelling around her eyes, the unnatural fullness of her lips. How much did you spend, Jessica? The whole 15,000. She avoided my gaze, suddenly finding her phone screen fascinating. It was an investment package, she said defensively. Brazilian butt lift, breast augmentation, lip fillers, and some facial contouring. The surgeon offered a discount for multiple procedures. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining her in consultation rooms, planning her transformation with my money, my years of sacrifice and careful saving. She'd turned my dreams into her vanity project, without a moment's hesitation or guilt. The wedding is in 3 weeks, Jessica. 3 weeks, do you understand what you've done? She finally looked at me directly, her expression mixing defiance with the first hint of uncertainty. You can postpone it, she said, as if rescheduling a wedding was as simple as moving a dentist appointment. People will understand. Besides, maybe this is a sign that you're rushing into marriage anyway. Her casual dismissal of my devastation was breathtaking in its cruelty. She'd stolen my wedding fund, and was now suggesting that my ruined plans were somehow for the best. I wanted to scream, to grab her by her surgically enhanced shoulders, and shake her until she understood the magnitude of what she'd done, but I knew it would be pointless. Jessica had never understood consequences, and she wasn't going to start now. Where are Mom and Dad? I asked, knowing I needed witnesses for this conversation, people who could hold her accountable for her actions. They're at the office, she said, already turning back to her phone. They know about the surgery, by the way. They think it's a great investment in my future. Mom even said, I look more photogenic now. The revelation that our parents knew about her surgery hit me like another betrayal. They'd watched her transform herself with my stolen money, and said nothing, offered no warnings or questions about where she'd gotten the funds. I thought about all the times I'd defended their favoritism, made excuses for their unequal treatment, convinced myself that they loved us both equally in their own way. I need you to call the surgeon and cancel whatever procedures you haven't had yet, Jessica. Return whatever money you can, and give me the rest. She laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Maya, that's not how surgery works. You can't return a Brazilian butt lift like it's a sweater from Target. The money is spent, the procedures are done. Then you need to figure out how to pay me back, I said, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. Get a job, sell something, take out a loan. I don't care how you do it, but you're going to return every penny you stole from me. Her expression shifted to something approaching panic, as if the idea of actual consequences was finally penetrating her self-absorbed bubble. Maya, be reasonable, she said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone I recognized from childhood. I can't get a job right now, I'm still healing from surgery, and I can't take out a loan without income or credit. You know I'll pay you back eventually, when my influencer career takes off, just give me some time. Eventually wasn't good enough. Time wasn't something I had with my wedding 3 weeks away. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw a stranger who'd stolen my future without a second thought. The Jessica I'd protected and defended for years had never really existed. She'd been this selfish, manipulative person all along, and I'd been too blind to see it. I left her by the pool and drove directly to my parents' accounting office, a small suite in a strip mall that had housed Chen and Associates for the past 15 years. The familiar smell of coffee and printer toner hit me as I walked through the door, past the reception area, where Mom's assistant, Mrs. Patterson, greeted me with a warm smile. Your parents are with a client, dear, but they should be finished soon, she said, gesturing toward the conference room, where I could hear Dad's voice explaining tax implications. I told her I'd wait, settling into one of the uncomfortable chairs in the lobby and rehearsing what I was going to say. When Mom and Dad finally emerged, walking their elderly client to the door with professional smiles and handshakes, they turned to me with expressions of mild surprise. Maya, sweetie, what brings you by? Mom asked, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was busy, and hoped whatever I needed wouldn't take long. I need to talk to both of you about Jessica, I said, standing up and following them into Dad's office. About the surgery she paid for with my wedding fund money. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as both parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. Mom settled into the chair behind her desk, her expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. Jessica mentioned she'd had some cosmetic procedures, she said carefully. She looks lovely, very natural, but I'm not sure what that has to do with your wedding fund. The innocent act was more infuriating than Jessica's blatant defiance had been. I pulled out the bank statements again, spreading them across Dad's desk, like playing cards. She stole $15,000 from my wedding account, I said, my voice deadly calm. My entire wedding fund, gone, so she could get a Brazilian butt lift and breast augmentation. Dad picked up the statements, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he examined the transactions. His expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Maya, these show authorized withdrawals, he said slowly. If Jessica had access to your account, then technically this isn't theft. The word technically hit me like a slap. My own father was looking for legal loopholes to excuse my sister's betrayal, instead of acknowledging the moral outrage of what she'd done. I stared at him, remembering all the times he'd taught me about right and wrong, about treating people with respect and honesty. She didn't have permission to take that money, Dad. She used access I'd given her to help with wedding planning, and stole everything I'd saved for 2 years. The wedding is in 3 weeks, and now we have nothing. He removed his glasses, cleaning them with excessive care while he chose his words. Jessica is going through a difficult time right now, he said finally. She's trying to build a career in a very competitive field, and sometimes that requires investments that might seem frivolous to other people. I'm sure she intended to ask you before using the money. Intended to ask was a new level of enablement I hadn't expected even from my parents. Mom nodded along, her expression sympathetic but directed entirely toward Jessica rather than me. She's been working so hard on her personal brand, Maya. You know how cruel social media can be, especially toward young women. She probably felt like she needed these enhancements to compete. I looked between my parents, these people who'd raised me to believe in fairness and accountability, and saw strangers making excuses for theft because the thief was their favorite daughter. The realization that they would never hold Jessica accountable, no matter what she did, settled over me like a heavy blanket. "So what are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, that I should just accept that my wedding fund is gone, that I should postpone my wedding because Jessica decided she needed surgery more than I needed my dreams. Mom reached across the desk, as if to pat my hand, but I pulled away before she could make contact. "We're saying that family is more important than money, sweetie. David will understand. You can have a smaller wedding, or wait a few months until you save up again. Jessica's procedures can't be undone." The casual way she dismissed my devastation while protecting Jessica's choices was breathtaking. I thought about all the times I'd worked late into the night, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the dreams I'd invested in that wedding fund. None of it mattered to them because Jessica's wants would always supersede my needs. "What if I call the police?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't. "What if I report this as theft and let the legal system decide whether it was authorized?" Both parents stiffened, their professional composure cracking slightly. "Maya, you wouldn't do that to your sister," Dad said, his voice carrying a warning I'd heard directed at me countless times over the years. "Think about what that would do to our family, to our business reputation. Jessica made a mistake, but destroying her life won't get your money back." A mistake. 26 years of favoritism and enabling had led to this moment, where my parents could watch Jessica steal my wedding fund and call it a mistake. I stood up, gathering the bank statements that had become evidence of my family's true priorities. "I'm not destroying her life," I said, my voice steady, despite the emotion churning in my chest. "She destroyed mine. And you're all okay with that as long as it protects Jessica from consequences." Mom started to protest, but I held up a hand to stop her. "For years I've made excuses for the way this family treats me versus how you treat Jessica. I've told myself that you love us equally, just differently. But this proves that you don't. You'd rather see me lose everything I've worked for than hold her accountable for stealing it." I walked toward the door, pausing to look back at my parents one last time. "When Jessica's surgery complications require care, when her influencer career doesn't take off, when she needs money for her next crisis, remember this moment. Remember that you chose her over me, and don't expect me to be there to clean up the mess." The drive home was a blur of rage, hurt, and a strange sense of clarity I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I saw my family dynamics with perfect clarity. I wasn't the beloved daughter who could do no wrong, I was the reliable daughter who would always sacrifice for everyone else's benefit. The distinction was crucial, and it changed everything. David was waiting when I got back to our apartment, having left work early when I'd texted him about the confrontation with my family. He took one look at my face and pulled me into his arms without asking questions. We stood in our living room, surrounded by wedding planning materials and dreams that felt impossibly far away. "They're not going to help," I told him, my voice muffled against his shoulder. "They think I should just accept it and postpone our wedding. They think Jessica's surgery was more important than our future." David held me tighter, his own anger evident in the tension of his muscles. "Then we'll figure it out ourselves," he said firmly. "We'll elope, we'll postpone, we'll have a courthouse ceremony. I don't care how we get married, Maya, as long as we do." But I shook my head, knowing that wasn't the real issue anymore. "It's not about the wedding, David, it's about what this means, about who they really are. I can't marry you while carrying this betrayal, this knowledge that my own family would rather see me destroyed than hold Jessica accountable. You deserve better than a wife who comes with this kind of toxic baggage." He pulled back to look at me, his expression serious and determined. "Maya Chen, you are not your family. You are not responsible for their choices or their failures. I'm marrying you, not them. We can have boundaries, we can limit contact, we can build our own life separate from their drama." His words were exactly what I needed to hear, but I knew the situation was more complicated than boundaries and limited contact could fix. Jessica had stolen $15,000, and my parents had essentially endorsed her actions. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved with better communication. Tyler arrived an hour later with Thai food and a laptop, settling at our kitchen table like he was preparing for battle. Okay, he said, opening containers of pad thai and green curry, let's figure out what options we have. Legal, financial, and nuclear. I want to explore every avenue before we decide how to handle this. We spent the evening researching theft laws, family court procedures, and small claims options. Tyler had been right about the legal complexities without Jessica's admission of guilt or clear evidence of criminal intent. Prosecuting her would be difficult and expensive. The civil court route was more promising, but it would take months to resolve. David suggested we consider a completely different approach. What if we expose what she did publicly, he asked. Post the bank statements on social media, let everyone see what kind of person Jessica really is. She cares more about her image than anything else. The idea had appeal, but Tyler shook his head. That makes Maya look vindictive, and it won't get the money back. Plus, Jessica's so delusional, she'd probably spin it into some kind of victim narrative about family jealousy. We need something more strategic. As we talked through possibilities, a plan began to form in my mind. Jessica had stolen my wedding fund to invest in her appearance and her social media career. She believed her surgical enhancements would make her famous and wealthy. What if I helped her achieve that goal in a way she never expected? The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the local news station where my college friend Marcus worked as an investigative reporter. KCRA had been running a series on social media fraud and the dark side of influencer culture, and I thought Jessica's story might interest them. Marcus listened to my explanation with growing excitement, his journalistic instincts clearly engaged by the human interest angle. This is perfect, Maya, he said, scrolling through Jessica's social media profiles on his phone. Young woman steals sister's wedding fund for plastic surgery, family enables the theft, it's got everything: betrayal, social media obsession, family dysfunction. We spent 2 hours planning the story, discussing angles and evidence needed to make it compelling television. Marcus wanted bank statements before and after photos, interviews with family members if possible. He also wanted to explore the broader implications of social media culture and cosmetic surgery addiction. I'm not trying to destroy Jessica, I told him, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. I just want people to see what really happened, what this obsession with appearance and social media fame can do to families. Marcus nodded, his expression understanding. Sometimes the truth is destructive, Maya, but that doesn't make it wrong to tell it. If Jessica didn't want to face consequences for her actions, she shouldn't have stolen $15,000 from her sister. This story might actually help other families avoid the same situation. By the time I left the news station, I felt lighter than I had since discovering the theft. For years, I'd been protecting Jessica from the consequences of her actions, enabling her just as much as our parents had. This time, the consequences would be public, permanent, and entirely of her own making. That evening, David and I sat in our favorite restaurant in downtown Sacramento, a quiet Italian place where we'd celebrated our engagement 2 years earlier. The irony of returning to the scene of our happiness while our wedding lay in ruins wasn't lost on either of us. "Are you sure about the news story?" he asked, twirling pasta around his fork without much appetite. "Once it airs, there's no taking it back. Your relationship with your family will never be the same." I considered his words, thinking about all the family dinners, holidays, and celebrations that would be forever changed. My relationship with my family was already over. I said finally. They made that choice when they decided Jessica's wants were more important than my needs. I'm just making it official. David reached across the table to take my hand, his expression both proud and sad. "Then I support whatever you decide to do. Jessica created this situation, and your parents enabled it. You shouldn't have to carry the burden of protecting them from their own choices. His unwavering support meant everything to me, especially when my own family had proven so unreliable. The next few days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I went to work, completed projects, met with clients, all while knowing that everything was about to change. Marcus called regularly with updates on the story's development, confirming details and scheduling the interview that would expose Jessica's theft to the entire Sacramento metropolitan area. Jessica, meanwhile, continued posting on social media as if nothing had happened. Her feed was filled with selfies showcasing her surgical results, inspirational quotes about self-improvement, and hints about major announcements coming soon. She'd gained a few followers in the days since her surgery, mostly creepy older men commenting inappropriately on her photos. Our parents called twice, both times asking me to reconsider pursuing any kind of legal action against Jessica. Mom left a voicemail talking about family loyalty and forgiveness, as if I were the one who needed to ask for forgiveness. Dad sent a text suggesting we all sit down for a family meeting to work things out reasonably. Their attempts at damage control only strengthened my resolve. They were still protecting Jessica, still treating me like the problem that needed to be managed, rather than the victim who deserved justice. After 26 years of this treatment, I was finally done enabling their dysfunction. The interview was scheduled for Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week before my wedding was supposed to take place. Marcus had assembled an impressive package, including financial documents, social media screenshots, and expert commentary on cosmetic surgery addiction and family dynamics. The story would air on Sunday evening, giving it maximum impact during the weekend news cycle. Thursday night, I called Tyler to let him know about the upcoming broadcast. He was quiet for a long moment after I explained the situation, and I could practically hear him processing the implications. "Maya, are you absolutely certain about this?" he asked finally. "I mean, I support you completely, but once this airs, Jessica is going to be a local laughingstock. Your parents' business could be affected. There might be consequences you haven't thought through." His concern was touching, but my decision was final. "Jessica stole $15,000 from me, Tyler. She destroyed my wedding, my trust, my relationship with my family, and everyone expects me to just quietly accept it to protect her reputation. I'm done protecting people who won't protect me." Tyler sighed, but his voice was supportive when he spoke again. "Okay then, I'll be watching Sunday night, and I'll be ready to deal with whatever fallout comes after. You're not facing this alone, Maya. David and I are with you no matter what happens." Friday afternoon, I sat in the news studio under bright lights, my hands folded calmly in my lap as Marcus asked questions I'd been preparing to answer all week. The cameras captured every word as I explained Jessica's theft, my parents' response, and the impact on my wedding and my life. When Marcus asked if I had any message for Jessica, I looked directly into the camera and spoke from my heart. "Actions have consequences, Jessica. You can't steal someone's dreams and expect them to stay silent about it. I hope your surgery was worth destroying our relationship and humiliating our family on television." The interview lasted an hour, but I knew only a few minutes would make it into the final broadcast. Marcus assured me that the most impactful moments would be included, and that the story would generate the kind of attention that might actually prompt some accountability from Jessica or my parents. Driving home from the studio, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that surprised me with its intensity. For the first time in years, I'd taken control of a situation instead of just accepting whatever Jessica and my parents decided was best. The consequences might be severe, but at least they would be consequences I'd chosen rather than circumstances forced upon me. That weekend, David and I drove to Lake Tahoe for what we jokingly called our pre-wedding funeral. We hiked mountain trails, ate at restaurants we'd never tried, and talked about our future in ways that felt both hopeful and uncertain. The wedding we'd planned was gone, but our relationship felt stronger for having survived this crisis. Sunday evening found us back in Sacramento, sitting on our couch with Thai takeout and nervous energy as the news broadcast began. Marcus had texted earlier to confirm that the story was the lead piece, scheduled to air after the opening credits and weather tease. When my face appeared on screen, looking composed and determined under the studio lights, I felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. There was no taking back what I was about to unleash on my family, no undoing the public humiliation that Jessica was about to experience. But as I heard my own voice explaining the theft and its impact, I knew I'd made the right choice. The story was even more devastating than I'd expected. Marcus had included security footage from Jessica's plastic surgery consultations, showing her paying with cash that could only have come from my stolen wedding fund. He'd interviewed a financial expert about the long-term impact of wedding postponements and family theft. Most damaging of all, he'd included recent social media posts from Jessica bragging about her surgery results, while my wedding lay in ruins. As the segment ended with a close-up of my bank statements showing the zero balance, David squeezed my hand and smiled. "You did it, Maya. You finally stood up for yourself in a way they can't ignore or excuse. Now we wait and see what happens next." 3 months after Jessica's arrest made national headlines, I received a call that would change everything once again. Detective Martina's voice carried an unusual excitement as she explained that the FBI had taken over Jessica's case due to its connection to a much larger fraud operation spanning multiple states. The investigation had uncovered something none of us anticipated. Jessica hadn't been working alone in her elaborate scam networks. She was part of a sophisticated ring of fraudsters who specialized in social media manipulation and crowdfunding deception, with connections to similar operations across the country. My sister, who I'd always seen as an incompetent wannabe influencer, had actually been a skilled operative in a criminal enterprise that had stolen millions from unsuspecting victims. The revelation recontextualized everything I thought I knew about Jessica's behavior. Her theft of my wedding fund wasn't an impulsive decision by a desperate person seeking validation through plastic surgery. It was a calculated move by someone who'd been trained to identify and exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of family members and strangers alike. Federal agents had been monitoring the fraud ring for over a year before Jessica's arrest provided the breakthrough they needed. Her sloppy execution of the wedding fund theft, driven by overconfidence and family familiarity, had exposed communication networks and financial channels that connected dozens of fraudsters across the western United States. The scope of the operation was staggering. The ring had developed sophisticated methods for creating fake online personas, complete with stolen photographs, fabricated backstories, and carefully crafted appeals designed to maximize emotional manipulation. They'd targeted everyone from elderly widows seeking companionship to young parents struggling with medical bills, systematically draining savings accounts and retirement funds through elaborate long-term deceptions. Jessica's role had been specifically focused on family financial abuse, using her natural understanding of family dynamics to develop techniques for manipulating relatives into providing access to accounts, personal information, and large sums of money. The training materials seized from the organization included detailed psychological profiles and manipulation strategies that read like a handbook for destroying family relationships. My wedding fund theft had been what the FBI called a proof-of-concept operation, designed to test Jessica's ability to execute large-scale family financial manipulation before moving her up to more sophisticated targets. The success of her theft had apparently earned her promotion within the organization and access to victims with much larger financial resources. The federal investigation revealed that Jessica had been recruited through her legitimate attempts at social media influence, approached by someone who claimed to be offering mentorship in building online audiences and monetizing social platforms. The recruitment process had been gradual, starting with seemingly innocent advice about creating compelling content and gradually evolving into training on deception and financial manipulation. Detective Martinez explained that many of the ring's operatives had similar backgrounds, people with social media aspirations who'd been gradually corrupted through a process that normalized increasingly unethical behavior. The organization preyed on individuals who were already struggling with self-image issues and financial insecurity, offering them a sense of belonging and success that came at the cost of their moral compass. The realization that Jessica had been both perpetrator and victim in this situation created a complex emotional response I hadn't anticipated. While her actions were still inexcusable and had caused real harm to me and numerous other victims, understanding that she'd been systematically manipulated and trained by experienced criminals added layers of tragedy to an already devastating situation. The federal charges Jessica now faced were far more serious than the state-level fraud convictions. Wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering charges carried potential sentences that could keep her imprisoned for decades. The prosecutors were offering reduced sentences to operatives who cooperated with the investigation, but Jessica's continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions made her an unlikely candidate for leniency. More significantly for my own situation, the federal investigation had identified assets and accounts controlled by the fraud ring that could potentially provide restitution to victims far beyond what individual prosecutions had recovered. The FBI had seized bank accounts, real estate, and other assets purchased with stolen funds, creating a victim compensation fund that could provide more substantial financial recovery. My attorney, Mr. Hoffman, was cautiously optimistic about the potential for additional restitution through the federal case. The documentation I'd provided about Jessica's theft had become crucial evidence in understanding the ring's family manipulation techniques, making my case a priority for the victim compensation process. The media attention surrounding the expanded investigation was intense, but different from the local coverage of Jessica's original arrest. National news outlets were focusing on the broader implications of organized social media fraud, rather than the personal family drama that had initially driven coverage of my story. This shift felt like a relief, allowing me to step back from the spotlight while still seeing justice pursued for Jessica's crimes. The book project with Patricia Williams took on new dimensions as the scope of Jessica's criminal involvement became clear. What had started as a memoir about family financial abuse was evolving into an investigation of how organized crime exploited family relationships and social media platforms to commit fraud on an unprecedented scale. Patricia was particularly interested in exploring how the fraud ring had weaponized normal family dynamics, turning natural tendencies toward trust and forgiveness into vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited. The psychological techniques Jessica had learned weren't just random manipulation tactics, they were refined methods developed through extensive criminal experience. Writing about this expanded understanding of Jessica's crimes required me to revisit my own experiences with fresh perspective. Behaviors I'd attributed to selfishness or immaturity were revealed to be calculated applications of psychological manipulation techniques. The guilt trips, emotional blackmail, and systematic boundary violations had all been learned skills rather than personality flaws. This realization was both liberating and disturbing. On one hand, it confirmed that my instincts about Jessica's behavior had been correct, and that my decision to pursue accountability had been justified. On the other hand, it meant that my family had been infiltrated by someone who'd been trained to exploit our relationships for criminal purposes. The impact on my parents was profound when they learned about Jessica's involvement with organized crime. Mom's initial reaction was denial, insisting that Jessica had been manipulated and wasn't truly responsible for her actions. Dad was more realistic about the implications, recognizing that Jessica's sophisticated deception couldn't be explained by simple poor judgment or social media obsession. The family therapy sessions that had been progressing slowly took on new urgency as we grappled with the reality that Jessica had been essentially a foreign agent within our family unit, trained to identify and exploit our emotional vulnerabilities for criminal gain. The therapist helped us understand that we'd been victims of a sophisticated con operation that had been designed to be nearly undetectable by family members. David's reaction to the expanded investigation was relief mixed with vindication. He'd always felt that Jessica's behavior toward me was unusually calculated and cruel, even by the standards of difficult family relationships. Learning that her actions had been informed by criminal training explained the particular effectiveness of her manipulation techniques. Our relationship had grown stronger throughout the crisis, but the revelation about Jessica's true nature created a new level of closeness between us. We'd survived not just family drama but actual infiltration by organized crime, and our ability to navigate that challenge together proved the resilience of our partnership. Tyler's response was characteristic of his analytical nature. He immediately began researching the fraud ring and its methods, fascinated by the intersection of technology, psychology, and criminal enterprise. His technical background allowed him to understand aspects of the operation that law enforcement found particularly challenging, and he provided valuable insights that helped me process the expanded scope of Jessica's crimes. The speaking engagements I'd been doing about family financial abuse took on new relevance as awareness of organized social media fraud increased. Audiences were particularly interested in learning how to recognize the difference between normal family conflict and systematic manipulation by trained criminals. The techniques Jessica had used were apparently becoming more common as fraud rings expanded their operations. Carmen's coffee shop in Portland became an unofficial headquarters for processing the emotional impact of these revelations. Our conversations about family betrayal evolved into discussions about how criminal organizations exploited normal human relationships for financial gain. Her own experience with financial betrayal by her ex-husband provided valuable perspective on recovery from trust violations. The Portland business community's response to my expanded story was supportive and protective. Several local entrepreneurs shared their own experiences with sophisticated fraud attempts, creating an informal network for sharing information about suspicious business approaches or requests for personal information. The creative community's natural suspicion of anything that seemed too good to be true proved valuable in identifying potential fraud attempts. The federal investigation timeline meant that Jessica's final sentencing would be delayed for at least another year as prosecutors built their case against the broader organization. The additional time in custody was difficult for my parents, who struggled with the extended uncertainty about Jessica's future, but it provided more time for our family to process the full scope of what had happened to us. The Victim Compensation Fund, established through the federal investigation, eventually provided an additional $8,000 in restitution, bringing my total recovery to over $20,000. The excess beyond my original $15,000 loss was designated as compensation for emotional distress and the role my case had played in exposing the broader criminal operation. This financial recovery allowed David and me to not only rebuild our wedding plans but to exceed them significantly. We decided to use the money to create the celebration we'd actually wanted rather than the one we'd felt obligated to have for family expectations. The ceremony we ultimately planned was smaller but more meaningful, focused on our community of chosen family rather than biological obligations. The venue we selected was a small winery in the Columbia River Gorge, with a view of the waterfalls and mountains that had drawn us to the Pacific Northwest. The guest list included fewer than 30 people, all of whom had demonstrated genuine support for our relationship throughout the crisis with Jessica. The intimacy of the celebration created space for authentic joy rather than performative happiness. Carmen catered the reception through her coffee shop, creating a menu that reflected both our tastes and the values of sustainability and local sourcing that had become important to us. Tyler served as my person of honor, acknowledging that traditional gender roles for wedding parties seemed less relevant after everything we'd experienced. Several Portland friends provided music, photography, and flowers, turning the wedding into a community celebration rather than a commercial transaction. My parents attended via video call, still working to rebuild trust but respecting our decision to limit their physical presence at major life events. Their participation felt appropriate for the current state of our relationship, involved but not central, supportive but not controlling. The boundary we'd established felt healthy for everyone involved. Jessica's absence from the wedding was not acknowledged or mourned. She'd forfeited any role in my life when she chose criminal manipulation over honest relationship, and her current incarceration was simply the logical consequence of that choice. The wedding celebration was about the people who'd chosen to support us rather than exploit us. The honeymoon was a month-long road trip through the Western National Parks, funded by the excess restitution money and timed to coincide with the peak autumn season. The trip felt symbolic of the new life we were building together, exploring unfamiliar territory with confidence rather than fear, trusting our ability to handle whatever challenges we might encounter. The photography I took during the trip became the foundation for a new aspect of my business, landscape and travel photography that complemented my existing portrait and commercial work. The images also provided material for a gallery show that Carmen hosted at her coffee shop, creating another bridge between my creative work and the community that had embraced us in Portland. The final chapter of Jessica's story came 18 months later when she was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison as part of a plea agreement that required her to testify against other members of the fraud ring. The sentence was longer than anyone in my family had expected, but it reflected both the scope of her crimes and her leadership role within the criminal organization. The sentencing hearing provided closure I hadn't realized I needed. Seeing Jessica in federal prison clothing, acknowledging her crimes in open court, and accepting responsibility for the harm she'd caused, created a sense of finality that had been missing throughout the extended investigation and prosecution process. Her statement to the court was the first time I'd heard Jessica take genuine responsibility for her actions without attempting to justify or minimize them. Whether this represented actual growth or strategic positioning for eventual parole consideration was unclear, but the acknowledgement itself was significant for the victims who'd been denied any recognition of the harm they'd experienced. The book was published 2 years after my wedding fund was stolen, timed to coincide with Jessica's final sentencing and the conclusion of the broader federal investigation. The publisher's marketing campaign emphasized the contemporary relevance of family financial abuse in the age of social media fraud, positioning my story as both personal memoir and cautionary tale about modern criminal enterprises. Early reviews were positive, with several critics noting the book's unique perspective on how organized crime had evolved to exploit family relationships and social media platforms. The combination of personal narrative and broader social analysis appealed to readers interested in both human interest stories and contemporary crime trends. The book tour took me to cities across the country, speaking to audiences ranging from financial literacy groups to law enforcement conferences. The consistent theme in audience questions was how to distinguish between normal family conflict and systematic manipulation by trained criminals. My experience provided concrete examples of warning signs that many people found helpful in evaluating their own family relationships. Success of the book led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies, developing training materials about family financial abuse and social media fraud. My first-hand experience with sophisticated manipulation techniques provided insights that helped investigators recognize similar patterns in other cases. 5 years after Jessica stole my wedding fund, I stood in the expanded Portland studio space, reviewing client portfolios and planning projects that would have been impossible to imagine during the crisis that had brought David and me to the Pacific Northwest. The business had grown beyond my initial dreams, employing 3 other creatives and serving clients throughout the region. The woman who'd discovered her empty wedding account was a different person from who I'd become. She'd been focused on earning approval from people who were incapable of giving it authentically, prioritizing family harmony over personal well-being. The person I'd become understood that love and manipulation were incompatible and that healthy relationships required mutual respect and genuine care. Jessica remained in federal prison with a projected release date still several years in the future. I received periodic updates about her status through the victim notification system but had no contact with her directly. Her choices had created a permanent separation between us that no amount of time or claimed rehabilitation could bridge. The final lesson from this experience was that family relationships, like all relationships, had to be earned and maintained through consistent positive behavior. Biology and shared history created opportunities for connection, but they didn't create obligations to accept harmful treatment. The family I'd built in Portland was smaller than the one I'd been born into in Sacramento, but it was infinitely more supportive and authentic. Carmen had become the sister I'd never really had, providing advice, encouragement, and unconditional support without expecting anything in return except friendship. Our relationship demonstrated what family could look like when it was based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than manipulation. Looking back on Jessica's theft of my wedding fund, I could see it as the catalyst that had freed me from a toxic family dynamic and led to everything good in my current life. Her criminal training had made her particularly effective at manipulation, but it had also made her careless in ways that ultimately exposed her crimes and led to justice for her many victims. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica's attempt to steal my future through sophisticated criminal techniques had ultimately destroyed her own prospects while creating opportunities for me that exceeded my original dreams. Sometimes the best revenge really was building a life so fulfilling that the person who tried to harm you became completely irrelevant to your happiness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.